In the autumn of 1914, as the world teetered on the brink of the Great War and nations turned their eyes toward conflict and conquest, one man and his crew embarked upon a different kind of battle, a battle not against armies, but against nature itself, in its most merciless form. Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton, a seasoned polar explorer, stood upon the deck of his ship, Endurance, her black hull gleaming wet under the pale November sun, as she prepared to leave the island of South Georgia and sail into the cold, wild heart of the Antarctic. His vision was audacious, almost unthinkable for its time, to cross the entire Antarctic continent from one side to the other, a journey of nearly 2,900 kilometers, traversing the most desolate and hostile environment on Earth. He called this venture the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a name filled with the pride and ambition of the Edwardian era, and yet behind its grandeur lay a simple, relentless human drive to explore what had not yet been conquered. The Endurance, a three-masted barkentine built in Norway and designed to withstand the crushing pressure of polar ice, was more than a ship, it was a dream forged in oak and steel. Shackleton's crew, 27 men chosen from thousands of applicants, included sailors, scientists, carpenters, a photographer named Frank Hurley, and even a stowaway who had snuck aboard just before departure. Together, they set their course through the treacherous Weddell Sea, toward a bay on the Antarctic coast called Vosel Bay, where their march across the continent was to begin. But from the very start, the sea seemed to sense their intentions and rise against them. Ice lay thick and unbroken, shifting and grinding with the power of mountains, and by the time Endurance entered the Weddell Sea in December 1914, she found herself trapped in a frozen vice that would never let her go. The crew could only watch as floes of ice, 10 feet thick, closed around their vessel, immobilizing her completely. For days they tried to break free, using the engines, chisels, saws, and sheer muscle to cut through the ice, but the sea would not yield. The temperature dropped, the days shortened, and the sun dipped below the horizon for the long Antarctic night. Shackleton, calm yet unyielding, made a decision that marked the beginning of one of the greatest survival stories ever told. They would winter in the ice and wait for the thaw of spring to release them. Through that first polar winter, the crew of Endurance transformed their imprisoned ship into a floating fortress against the elements. Hurley captured haunting photographs of the vessel encased in glassy ridges of frozen sea, her masts pointing toward a sky that rarely saw the sun. Men slept in cabins rimed with frost, their breath crystallizing in the air, while outside, the wind howled like an animal across the desolation. The temperature often fell below -50 degrees Celsius. Yet in that darkness, they maintained discipline and even a kind of rough humor. They played games, held mock trials, celebrated holidays, and kept the ship in the best condition possible, clinging to Shackleton's unwavering belief that Endurance, true to the ship's name, would see them through. But nature's patience wore thin before theirs did. As the spring of 1915 arrived, the ice did not loosen its grip, instead, it tightened. Pressure ridges rose around the ship like waves of solid stone, creaking and booming as the floes ground together. On the evening of October 24, a thunderous crack split the silence, and a jagged block of ice struck the ship's stern, tearing open her hull. Water poured in. The crew manned the pumps for hours, but the icy sea was relentless. Shackleton realized the ship was doomed. With a calm that belied the enormity of the moment, he gave the order no captain ever wishes to give: abandon ship. They salvaged what they could: food, sledges, tents, scientific instruments, and the 3 small lifeboats that would later become their salvation. As they stood upon the ice, watching their ship groan and sink into the dark beneath the floes, a silence fell over the men. It was as though the last link to civilization had vanished beneath their feet. They were alone now, stranded on a drifting continent of ice, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, without radio contact, without hope of rescue. Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica was gone. The only goal that remained was survival. He gathered his men and told them with quiet certainty, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." That sentence, simple and resolute, became the creed of their existence. The ice on which they camped, christened Ocean Camp, was not solid land but a floating sheet drifting slowly northward with the currents and wind. Each day they measured their position and realized they were being carried farther from their intended route. They slaughtered seals and penguins for food, melted ice for water, and rationed their biscuits. The dogs, once their companions and helpers, eventually became part of the food supply as provisions dwindled. Shackleton knew morale was as vital as calories. He kept the men busy with tasks, routines, and encouragement, never letting despair take hold. Even when he privately faced moments of hopelessness, he never allowed it to show. His leadership became the invisible flame that kept them from freezing in spirit. Weeks turned into months, and still the ice did not release them. On November 21, 1915, the Endurance finally succumbed to the crushing power of the sea and sank beneath the ice. The men stood in silence as the mast disappeared, some saluting, others unable to speak. Hurley risked his life to save as many photographic plates as possible, carrying the heavy glass negatives across the ice so that future generations could witness what they had endured. As the wreck slipped away, the men turned back to their tents. All they had now was what they could carry and each other. They continued to drift on the ice for months, waiting for a chance to reach open water. The endless white horizon offered no promise, no change, only the groaning of the ice beneath their feet and the howling of the wind. The sun returned with the brief Antarctic summer, softening the ice but also making it treacherous and unstable. Shackleton decided that when the floe broke apart, they would take to the boats and make for the nearest land, Paulet Island, or perhaps Elephant Island farther north. But the ice's movement was unpredictable. Sometimes they drifted closer to land, sometimes the wind reversed and carried them away again. Through it all, the men clung to the belief that Shackleton would lead them to safety. By March 1916, after more than a year adrift, the ice began to disintegrate beneath them. Cracks opened around their camp, and one night a man fell through, barely saved from the freezing water. Shackleton realized they could not remain a day longer. He ordered the 3 lifeboats James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills to be loaded with supplies. On April 9, 1916, they launched the boats into a chaotic sea filled with floating ice and freezing spray. For 7 days they rode through a nightmare of sleet, snow, and exhaustion, navigating through shifting floes and towering waves. Salt water froze on their faces, ice formed on their clothes until they were encased like statues. Yet they pressed on, driven by the instinct to live. When, on April 15, they finally saw land Elephant Island, the men wept openly. After nearly 500 days trapped on ice or at sea, they were standing once again on solid ground. But their joy was tempered by the harsh reality that this island was uninhabited, barren, and far from any shipping routes. Rescue from here was as unlikely as from the ice. Shackleton knew he had one desperate option left: to sail one of the boats across 1,300 kilometers of open ocean to the whaling stations on South Georgia, the same island they had left 18 months earlier. It was an almost impossible journey across the world's roughest waters, the dreaded Drake Passage, where waves reached heights of 12 meters and winds could tear a ship apart. Yet there was no other hope. Shackleton chose 6 men, including navigator Frank Worsley, and set out in the James Caird on April 24, 1916. As the small boat disappeared into the grey horizon, the men left behind on Elephant Island watched in silence, praying they would return. The James Caird's voyage would become legendary, a 17-day odyssey through storms, freezing spray, and relentless gales, with the 6 men battling exhaustion, frostbite, and despair. They took turns at the oars, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, constantly drenched and shivering, with barely space to stretch their legs. Ice formed on the ropes and sails, and every wave threatened to capsize them. Navigation depended on brief glimpses of the sun through storm clouds, and each sighting meant life or death. Shackleton's beard was frozen with salt, his hands were raw and bleeding. Yet through sheer will and courage, they pressed forward, until finally, on May 10, 1916, after more than 2 weeks at sea, the jagged cliffs of South Georgia appeared through the mist like a vision from another world. They had done the impossible, but their ordeal was not yet over. They had reached the island, but the winds had driven them to its uninhabited southern coast, a region of sheer glaciers and impassable mountains, while the whaling stations and human habitation lay on the opposite side more than 30 kilometers away across terrain no man had ever crossed. Their boat was too battered to sail around, and the men were too weak to attempt it. Shackleton made camp in a small cove they called King Haakon Bay, where they patched their wounds and dried their clothes by a meager fire of penguin blubber. The men were skeletal, their faces hollow, their hands cracked by salt and cold. For 2 days they rested, but Shackleton knew that every hour lost meant the men on Elephant Island were closer to death. On the morning of May 19, 1916, with the weather clearing, he made the fateful decision to cross the island's interior. He chose 2 companions, Tom Crean, the quiet Irishman whose endurance was matched only by his loyalty, and Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator who had steered them through the tempest. Carrying little more than a compass, a rope, an adze, and rations for 3 days, the 3 men set out to traverse a mountain range no one had mapped. They climbed through darkness and snow, their boots slipping on icy slopes, the sound of their breath lost in the roar of wind. For 36 continuous hours they marched, climbing ridges, descending valleys, sliding down glaciers in the dark, never stopping for fear that sleep would claim them forever. At one point, they heard the distant sound of a whistle, an echo that told them human life was near. Following it, they descended a final ridge and saw below them the roofs of Stromness whaling station glimmering in the weak light of dawn. They had made it. Exhausted beyond words, bearded, filthy, and clothed in rags, they stumbled into the station, startling the Norwegian workers who at first thought they were ghosts. Shackleton, barely able to speak, asked for the manager, Thorolf Sorrel, and when the man emerged, Shackleton simply said, "My name is Shackleton." Sorrel stared at him, then grasped his hand, understanding everything in that instant. The impossible had been achieved, they had survived the ice, the sea, and the mountains. But Shackleton's thoughts were not of rest, they were of the men he had left behind on Elephant Island. Within days, he organized a rescue mission, but nature, as if testing him one final time, placed obstacle after obstacle in his path. The first attempt, aboard a whaler named Southern Sky, was turned back by pack ice. The second, using an Uruguayan vessel called Instituto de Pesca No. 1, also failed. Undeterred, Shackleton tried again with a third ship, Emma, only to be repelled once more. Each time he was forced to return, his heart heavy but his determination unbroken. Finally, with the aid of the Chilean government, he obtained a small but powerful seagoing tug named Yelko, commanded by Captain Luis Pardo. On August 25, 1916, 4 months after he had left, Shackleton set out once again into the ice-filled seas of the Antarctic, refusing to return without his men. The Yelko forced her way through fog and floes, her steel hull shuddering with every collision, until, on the morning of August 30, they sighted the desolate outline of Elephant Island. As they drew closer, figures began to move on the beach, thin, ragged, and almost unbelieving. Shackleton leapt into a small boat and rowed ashore. When he reached the beach, his voice broke as he called out, "Are you all well?" Frank Wild, who had commanded the camp in his absence, stepped forward and answered, "All safe, all well, boss." Not a single man had been lost. The ordeal that had begun nearly 2 years earlier was over. Shackleton had kept his promise. The world hailed him as a hero, though his own eyes carried the shadow of the ice until his death. His expedition, though it failed in its original goal, had achieved something greater. It had demonstrated the unbreakable strength of the human spirit when faced with the vast indifference of nature. The story of endurance would become legend, a tale told wherever courage and leadership are valued. For the men who lived it, however, the memories never faded: the creak of ice, the roar of the wind, the endless white horizon that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of imagination. Yet beneath the hardship lay something profound, a sense of brotherhood forged in the crucible of survival. Shackleton's leadership, grounded in compassion as much as command, was the invisible thread that held them together. He understood that in such conditions, morale mattered more than orders, that humor and hope were as essential as rations and shelter. He treated each man as vital, from officers to seamen, and his fairness inspired loyalty that never wavered. His men later said they would have followed him to the ends of the earth, and indeed, they had. When they returned to civilization, the Great War still raged, and many soon found themselves once again in uniform, facing a different kind of peril. Some did not return. Yet to the end of their lives, those who had sailed on Endurance spoke of Shackleton not with fear or resentment but with reverence. They remembered the moment when the ship slipped beneath the ice, the bitter winds on the open boats, the first sight of land after 15 months adrift, and the quiet determination of the man who never surrendered. Frank Hawley's photographs, saved at such cost, later revealed to the world the stark beauty and unimaginable scale of their ordeal. The ship tilted among pressure ridges like a cathedral in ruins, the men smiling through frost and exhaustion, the vast expanse of ice stretching to infinity. These images, etched in silver and shadow, captured more than a moment in time. They captured the essence of human endurance. Even decades later, explorers and historians would study Shackleton's decisions as a model of crisis leadership. When faced with catastrophe, he focused not on blame but on survival, not on what was lost but on what could still be done. His calm presence reassured men on the brink of despair. His optimism, though sometimes forced, became contagious. In his diary, he once wrote, "Difficulties are just things to overcome, after all." Those words, simple yet profound, defined the ethos that carried them through. In the years following their return, Shackleton continued to dream of exploration. Restless and drawn ever southward, he launched another expedition in 1921 aboard a new ship, Quest, intending to circumnavigate Antarctica. But his health, strained by years of hardship, finally failed him. On January 5, 1922, he died suddenly of a heart attack in South Georgia, the same island that had marked both the beginning and the triumph of his greatest adventure. His men buried him there, at his own request, facing the sea he had loved. His grave, marked by a simple stone, stands today beneath the cold winds and grey skies of Grytviken, watched over by the wandering albatross and the ghosts of the ice. There, in that lonely place, the story of endurance seems to echo forever, the story of men who defied the impossible and of a leader whose name became synonymous with resilience. The world has since changed beyond recognition. Technology and satellites have mapped every corner of the Earth once considered unknown. Yet Shackleton's journey still speaks across the decades because it reminds us that exploration is not merely about geography but about the boundaries of the human spirit. To endure is to live, and to lead is to give others the strength to believe they can endure as well. When historians speak of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, the era of Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton, they speak not only of discovery but of sacrifice, of men who risked everything for knowledge and glory and who, in doing so, revealed something essential about humanity itself. Among them, Shackleton stands apart not for reaching the pole, for he never did, but for bringing every one of his men home alive. His was a triumph not of conquest but of compassion, and that, perhaps, is the greater victory. Today, the name endurance carries a resonance beyond its wooden frame, beyond the ice that crushed it and the ocean that swallowed it. It has come to symbolize courage, perseverance, and hope. In 2022, more than a century after the ship disappeared beneath the Weddell Sea, a modern expedition located her wreck, astonishingly intact, lying upright on the seafloor more than 3,000 meters below the surface. The name Endurance was still visible on her stern, letters gleaming faintly through the darkness, as if time itself had preserved the memory of those who sailed her. Seeing those images, one could almost imagine Shackleton and his crew still aboard, their faces turned toward the horizon, forever journeying into the unknown. The discovery served as a bridge between past and present, reminding the world that some stories do not fade, they endure. And yet, as remarkable as the rediscovery was, the true endurance lay not in the timbers preserved by the freezing depths but in the spirit of those who had sailed her, a spirit that still whispers through the ages whenever human beings confront impossible odds and refuse to yield. For the story of Shackleton and his men is more than a tale of exploration, it is a parable of resilience, leadership, and hope, written across a canvas of ice and darkness. When the Endurance vanished beneath the Weddell Sea in 1915, it seemed that all was lost, yet, paradoxically, it was in that moment of destruction that the expedition's real purpose began. Shackleton's genius lay not in avoiding disaster but in transforming it into triumph, in taking men who faced certain death and giving them the will to live. The lessons he embodied: the refusal to panic, the insistence on humor even in despair, the attention to the smallest human comforts in an environment stripped of comfort entirely, became a model for endurance that extended far beyond the frozen South. Generations of explorers, soldiers, and leaders have since studied his actions as a guide to surviving the impossible. What did he do when the ship was lost? He gathered his men, divided supplies equally, and made sure officers received no better food or shelter than the lowest sailor. When morale flagged, he organized entertainments, kept strict routines, and personally visited each tent to talk and encourage. He recognized that in isolation, fear grows in silence, and so he ensured there was always talk, laughter, a spark of life even when all else seemed frozen. Above all, he made them believe in him, not by words alone but by example. He never ate before others had eaten, never rested before others were safe, and never showed despair though his own heart was breaking. This, more than any navigational feat, was Shackleton's greatness, his mastery of the human soul. The men later said they followed him because he seemed incapable of imagining failure. Even when faced with the black immensity of the Antarctic night, he spoke as if salvation were a certainty. It was that certainty, rather than food or fire, that kept them alive. Consider the unimaginable isolation of their ordeal, hundreds of miles from the nearest human being, surrounded by an ocean of ice that stretched to the horizon, living in tents on a drifting floe where each creak beneath their feet could signal doom. The human mind is not made for such emptiness. Yet through the monotony of white days and endless nights, they held fast. They found beauty even in desolation: the auroras that painted the sky in curtains of green and violet, the playful curiosity of penguins that wandered into camp, the eerie stillness of a world untouched by time. Halley's camera captured these fleeting glimpses of grace amid hardship, transforming the ordeal into art. His photographs, preserved at such peril, are more than historical records, they are visual hymns to endurance itself. Through their stark contrasts of light and shadow, one senses the duality of their existence: the fragility of life against the immensity of nature, the small flame of human will flickering in an endless night. And within that fragile flame lay the power to outlast even death. When Shackleton returned to civilization and the world hailed him as a hero, he wore the praise uneasily. He had not sought glory, he had sought to bring his men home. The expedition had failed in its official goal, yet in the deeper sense, it had achieved something that transcended success or failure. It had shown that courage and compassion could coexist, that true leadership meant service, and that hope could survive even when reason said it could not. That paradox, the triumph born of defeat, is what has made the story of endurance eternal. Over a century later, scholars still analyze the expedition's diaries and logs, psychologists study Shackleton's methods of maintaining morale, and management experts cite him as the archetype of crisis leadership. In times of war, disaster, or corporate collapse, his name resurfaces as a touchstone for what it means to lead with humanity. And beyond all analysis, his story endures because it speaks to something timeless within us, the instinct to keep moving forward no matter how hopeless the path may seem. When we face our own white deserts, whether of grief, isolation, or uncertainty, we hear an echo from those frozen wastes, a reminder that endurance is not the absence of suffering but the refusal to let suffering define us. Shackleton's men, many of whom later wrote memoirs, often struggled to describe the transformation they had undergone. They spoke of moments when the boundary between life and death seemed to blur, when exhaustion became transcendence. On the journey across South Georgia, after 30 hours without rest, Shackleton himself later admitted that he felt a strange presence beside them, as though a fourth companion had walked unseen with the three of them. Others reported similar sensations, a quiet awareness that they were not entirely alone. Whether one interprets it as divine intervention or the heightened consciousness of men pushed beyond endurance, it remains one of the most haunting elements of their story, a hint that in the farthest reaches of human endurance, something greater than the individual self awakens. That sense of the sublime, of communion with forces both terrible and beautiful, is what gives the Endurance Saga its mythic power. It is not merely a tale of survival, it is a meditation on the boundaries of human experience. To stand on the ice where Shackleton once stood is to feel the thinness of the veil that separates courage from despair, life from death, insignificance from immortality. The Antarctic itself seems unchanged, as if holding their memory in its frozen heart. The winds still howl across the Weddell Sea, the sun still glints on fields of ice that stretch to the horizon, and somewhere far below, the Endurance still lies in her silent grave, her timbers untouched by time, her name shining faintly through the cold darkness. Each year, new explorers trace the routes of Shackleton's journey, carrying with them satellite beacons and modern gear, yet finding that technology cannot protect them from the awe his men must have felt. They return speaking of the same silence, the same immensity, the same humbling realization that in the face of nature's vastness, human beings are both insignificant and magnificent. And as they tell their tales, they keep alive the legacy of that expedition, the legacy of courage without arrogance, of hope without illusion. Shackleton's story endures because it belongs not to an age but to humanity itself. It is the story of what happens when everything is stripped away: comfort, security, even the illusion of control, and what remains is the raw, indomitable will to go on. In that sense, Endurance was not merely the name of a ship but a statement of faith, faith that the human heart, though fragile, is unbreakable when sustained by purpose and compassion. Standing before Shackleton's grave in South Georgia, one can almost hear the distant crash of waves and the whisper of wind through the grass, carrying his legacy across time. The inscription on his monument reads simply, "To the dear memory of Ernest Henry Shackleton, explorer." But those who know his story understand that the word explorer scarcely suffices. He was an explorer not only of lands uncharted but of the human soul, mapping its resilience, charting its depths, proving through his life and death that even in the coldest and darkest places, the light of courage endures. Thus, the saga of endurance becomes more than a chapter in the annals of exploration, it becomes a mirror in which we see ourselves, our fears, our hopes, our capacity to suffer and still believe. It is a reminder that, though ships may sink and dreams may shatter, the spirit that dares to dream cannot be destroyed. And so the story continues, carried by each generation that finds in Shackleton's journey a reflection of its own struggle against the ice of adversity. Long after the ice has melted and the world has changed beyond recognition, the name Endurance will remain, whispering through the winds of the south, that no storm lasts forever, that no darkness can extinguish the light of the human heart, and that in the face of the impossible, the truest measure of greatness is not conquest but endurance.